Forget Blackbeard. Forget Captain Kidd. The most powerful pirate in all of recorded history was not a weathered Englishman prowling the Caribbean. She was a woman from the South China Sea, and the scale of what she built makes every pirate you have ever heard of look like a rowboat next to a warship. At the height of her power, Ching Shih commanded 1,800 ships. 80,000 sailors answered to her code of law. She did not simply challenge the Chinese Imperial Navy, she defeated it. Twice. Then she turned around and humiliated the Portuguese Empire and the British East India Company in the same campaign. The empires of the world brought everything they had against her. They could not touch her. And when she finally walked away, she walked away on her own terms with her fleet intact, her treasury full, and her head still firmly on her shoulders. She died at 69, wealthy, respected, and in her own bed. No pirate came close to this. Not in scale, not in discipline, not in the sheer audacity of what she pulled off. This is the story of Ching Shih. She was born around 1775 in Guangdong Province, on the southern coast of China. Her birth name has been lost to history. The name the world knows her by, Ching Shih, simply means widow of Qing. Think about that for a moment. History named her after a dead husband and called it her identity. What history could not erase is the record of what she actually did. Guangdong in the late 18th century was one of the most economically active regions on Earth. The Pearl River Delta, where Guangzhou, Macau, and eventually Hong Kong would define global trade, was already a dense web of commerce, smuggling, and maritime power. The fishing communities that lined the delta existed in complicated relationship with the sea, dependent on it for survival, and subject to the pirate networks that treated South China Sea shipping as their private tax base. The young woman who would become Ching Shih worked, according to the most reliable historical accounts, aboard a floating brothel in Canton Harbor. This is where she first encountered Zheng Yi, the man who commanded the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most powerful pirate confederations in Chinese history. He wanted to marry her. She negotiated the terms herself. She agreed to marry Zheng Yi on one condition: equal co-ownership of his fleet and co-equal authority over all military decisions. He agreed. She was approximately 26 years old. In Imperial China, women had essentially no independent legal existence. She just secured contractual co-ownership of one of the largest military forces in Asia. The marriage took place around 1801. The 6 years that followed transformed the Red Flag Fleet from a significant regional force into something history had never seen. She had an instinct for organization, for the political management of competing interests, and for the economic structures that held large, fractious coalitions together. Together, they brought previously independent commanders into the Confederation. Through military pressure, strategic marriage alliances, and economic incentives that gave every smaller commander a personal stake in the organization's survival. By 1807, the Red Flag Fleet numbered several hundred ships and tens of thousands of sailors. Then, in a typhoon near the coast of Vietnam, Zheng Yi died. He was approximately 42 years old. Most stories of this era would end here. The widow steps back. Someone else takes charge. History moves on. This is not what happened. Ching Shih moved within weeks of her husband's death to consolidate absolute control of the Red Flag Fleet. She executed two simultaneous moves that reveal the political intelligence that would define her entire career. First, she secured the loyalty of Zhang Bao, the young commander who had been Zheng Yi's most trusted military lieutenant and adopted son. Zhang Bao was the finest naval tactician in the Confederation and had the unquestioned respect of its fighting men. She made him her chief military commander. She also made him her partner, a relationship that would eventually become her second marriage. Second, she issued a formal code of laws governing the entire Confederation. Not guidelines, not suggestions, a legal system, written down, published across the fleet, and enforced with absolute consistency. Within weeks of being widowed, she had locked in her most dangerous potential rival as a loyal subordinate, formalized her authority through law, and made it structurally impossible for any single commander to challenge her without challenging the entire legal framework the Confederation depended on. She was now in command of the largest pirate force the world had ever seen. She was approximately 32 years old. At Ching Shih established is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of organized crime, and frankly, in the history of organizational management. It governed everything: the distribution of plunder, the treatment of captives, the punishment for cowardice in battle, and the rights of wives of Confederation members. Rule 1. All plunder must be reported to the central register before any individual distribution. Theft from the register, death by beheading. No exceptions. Rule 2. Individual ships may not raid or attack independently without Confederation orders. Unauthorized action, execution. Rule 3. Any sailor who rapes a female captive faces execution. Consensual relations with a female captive require marriage or execution. Rule 4. Female captives are to be ransomed, sold, or released according to schedule. They are not to be harmed. Rule 5. Desertion from battle, ears cut off and paraded in front of the fleet. Second offense, death. These rules were not humanitarian impulses. They were organizational logic. You cannot run an operation of 80,000 people if every individual is doing whatever they personally choose. That is not an organization. It is a mob. Ching Shih understood something that most leaders never grasp. The source of her power was the coherence of the Confederation, and coherence required rules applied consistently regardless of who violated them. A commander who attacked a village that had purchased a Confederation protection pass was reported by that village. She heard the case. He had violated the agreement. He was executed. It cost her one commander. It purchased the credibility of the protection pass system across every merchant and coastal village in the South China Sea. The economic value of that credibility, measured in pass revenues and tribute payments across the years that followed, was many times greater than the loss of a single officer. She was not running a pirate operation. She was running a taxation empire, and taxation empires survive on trust. Ching Shih succeeded because she understood one thing that history's greatest leaders have always understood. Power is nothing without a code. The moment you stop enforcing your own rules is the moment your authority begins to dissolve. Here at this channel, we dig into the real history, the stories that didn't make it into your textbooks, the figures who were too complicated, too dangerous, or too inconvenient for the mainstream historical record to handle properly. If that sounds like the kind of history you want to explore, you need to be on this ship right now. Hit subscribe. Ring the bell. We drop new episodes every week and this community is growing fast. You do not want to come in late. Now back to the moment that three of the world's greatest naval powers decided they were going to end her. They were very wrong. By 1808, the Qing imperial government had a serious problem. The Red Flag Confederation was not just raiding coastal villages. It was operating a rival taxation system across South China Sea shipping. Merchants who wanted to operate safely paid Ching Shih's Confederation a protection pass fee, and they got genuine protection. The Qing dynasty was being economically bypassed in its own coastal waters. The provincial authorities of Guangdong assembled a fleet and moved against her. What followed was not a battle. It was an embarrassment. The imperial fleet was outmaneuvered, outfought, and defeated comprehensively. Several imperial commanders were captured. Their ships were seized and incorporated directly into the Red Flag fleet. The Qing sent a second, larger fleet. The result was identical: more ships added to her holdings, more weapons. The pattern was becoming a crisis. Portugal had maintained a colonial presence at Macau since 1557. By 1809, They had decided the Confederation was a problem that required a Portuguese solution. They dispatched a fleet. It was defeated. Some ships captured. Her reputation for invincibility grew. The British East India Company was watching all of this with alarm. Their trade routes connecting India, China, and Southeast Asia ran through waters this woman controlled. They dispatched ships to assist the Qing coalition. Three of the world's most powerful naval forces, the Chinese Imperial Navy, the Portuguese Colonial Fleet, and the British East India Company, were now in coalition against her. She remained undefeated. The combined coalition force moved against the Confederation in the waters near the Pearl River Delta, what some accounts call the Battle of the Tiger's Mouth. On paper, the coalition was overwhelming. In practice, it faced a problem no amount of firepower could solve. Ching Shih's sailors had spent their entire lives in those waters. They knew every shoal, every current, every seasonal wind pattern. They deployed fire ships against the coalition's tightly packed formation. They withdrew into the delta's thousands of narrow waterways when pressed, waterways the larger coalition ships could not follow, and reassembled when the attacking force withdrew. The combined coalition of three empires could not achieve a decisive victory against her. After 3 days of engagement, the coalition had lost ships, failed to destroy her fleet, and was forced into a strategic stalemate that everyone could see was not going to resolve in their favor. The world's greatest naval powers could not beat her on water. The Qing imperial government now faced a situation with no precedent in Chinese history. Their navy had failed. Portugal had failed. Britain had failed. Negotiation was the only remaining option, but the Confucian framework of imperial governance was poorly equipped to negotiate with criminals as equals. Criminals were to be suppressed and punished, not offered terms. Ching Shih understood the strategic situation with complete clarity. The Confederation was militarily undefeated and economically powerful, but it was not permanent. Maintaining 80,000 people on continuous war footing required constant revenue. The pass system worked, but it required constant enforcement. There was no long-term structural path that kept the Confederation intact indefinitely. She chose the moment, and she walked into the provincial governor's compound in 1810 to negotiate the terms herself. The deal she extracted was extraordinary. For her men, full imperial amnesty. They kept the ships they commanded. They kept the wealth they had accumulated. For Zhang Bao, integration into the Qing military at a rank reflecting his actual naval command experience. For herself, full retirement, all accumulated wealth retained. Marriage to Zhang Bao formalized under the new arrangement. No charges, no prosecution, complete personal freedom. She had walked into those negotiations as the leader of an undefeated military force, and she walked out with everything she needed. The Confederation's formal existence ended, but on a schedule and on terms she had chosen. This is not a defeat. A defeat is when your enemies force an outcome on you. What she achieved in 1810 was a strategic exit from a position that had reached its structural ceiling, extracted at maximum value, on her own timeline. After the settlement, Ching Shih retired to Canton. She operated a gambling house, technically illegal, but functioning with the kind of quiet tolerance from authorities that tells you her former power still cast a very long shadow. She married Zhang Bao officially. She built a life. She died in 1844, approximately 69 years old, wealthy in her own home, surrounded by family. This is not how pirates die in the stories. Pirates die in battle, or in flight, or on the gallows at the end of a noose. The most powerful pirate in history died in bed, at a ripe old age, having outlasted every enemy and every crisis her extraordinary career had produced. Now the comparison. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, operated for approximately 2 years as a major pirate and commanded at his peak perhaps 4 ships and 400 men. His career ended with his death in combat. Bartholomew Roberts, often cited as the most successful pirate by ships captured, operated for 3 years and was killed by the Royal Navy. Henry Every commanded one ship and spent the rest of his life in hiding. Ching Shih commanded 1,800 ships and 80,000 sailors. She defeated 3 empires simultaneously and was never beaten in battle. She retired on her own terms. She died at 69, wealthy in her own bed. No pirate in history came remotely close. The reason you may not have heard much about her until recently is simple. Western historians wrote about the piracy they were culturally connected to: the Caribbean buccaneers, the British maritime tradition, the golden age of piracy that filled their novels and their national mythology. The South China Sea, the Qing dynasty, and the internal economics of Chinese coastal trade were not their priority. The result is a massive distortion in the historical record that places mediocre European pirates at the center of piracy history and relegates the most successful pirate who ever lived to a footnote. Ching Shih was not a romantic figure in the tradition of pirate mythology. She was an extraordinary organizational leader who understood that power derives from structure, structure requires enforcement, and enforcement requires consistency. The sea was hers, and she gave it up only when she chose to. She proved that in the so-called golden age of piracy, the most dangerous weapon was never a cannon, never a boarding axe, never a fast ship. It was a brilliant, disciplined mind applied to the problem of power at scale. Thanks for watching. If this story hit differently, and it should, share it with someone who needs to know her name, and we will see you in the next one.